We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work.
We pay our respects to the elders past and present.
Throughout time, Brisbane, the land by the river,
has been a path of transport
for all people.
A place of connection.
A place of many tracks.
The ancestors and elders travelled this terrain long ago, following tracks
that we follow today.
We recognise their connection to this country,
The waterways and community.
As we build this path through country,
while we tunnel deep beneath our river, laying tracks for greater connection,
creating new places for the future.
we acknowledge the rich traditions and the stories of the past.
At the many places we are working to bring this project to life.
Across Brisbane,
The Gold Coast and Greater Southeast Queensland.
With an open heart
In mind,
We hope to
learn from the traditions, stories, customs,
and practices of Australia's First Nations people.
together,
as we build this track
For the future.
Hi, welcome to today's instalment of the National Archaeology Week lectures presented by the Cross River Rail Project. I'm Dr. Kate Quirk and I'm the Heritage Lead with Unity Alliance. And Unity Alliance is delivering the rail integration systems component of the Cross River Rail Project, which means that we are tying the new rail system in with the existing system. And to do that, we've been working on a lot of the oldest sections of Brisbane's railway system, including the stations between Fairfield and Salisbury, and also the sections north of the city between Victoria Park and the RNA. And it's Victoria Park that I'm going to be talking about today for this archaeology lecture. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Brisbane, Victoria Park is located in Spring Hill. It's about 1 kilometre north of the city. It's currently broken into two main sections. So to the west, there's playing fields and a golf course. In the middle, there's the inner city bypass and the railway. And then to the east, there's what we traditionally view as a park, which is lots of plantings and lawns and seating and all that sort of thing. Victoria Park is listed on the Queensland State Heritage Register as a place of state significance. And it's listed there for a few reasons. First is its historical value, because it's been a park for a long time. A rarity value, because there are some components of the park that really aren't found anywhere else. For typological reasons, because it represents a park. Also for aesthetic reasons. So there are lots of good vistas through the park, looking over, especially from the high side on the east, looking over towards the hospital. And there are nice vistas through the park with the plantings and the shade trees. It's also listed because it's of social value. So it's valued by the people of Brisbane who have been using it for a long time and have associations with it. Victoria Park is not currently listed for its research potential, or in this case, its archaeological potential. Which is, one wouldn't expect it to be. It's a park. Why would there be archaeology in the middle of a park? And that's because Victoria Park actually has a very long history, a great extent of which it wasn't really a park. So, before settlement occurred, Victoria Park was a gathering place for Aboriginal people. It is, or was, a low-lying swampy area. And swampy areas, they're not very pleasant to stay in, but they do offer a lot of different resources. They offer water and all different sorts of animal life. So they're very rich. They provide a lot of food resources. And the areas around the swamps make really good places for people to live because there's water and there's food. So it was an important place for Aboriginal people before settlement began. And then once settlement did begin, Victoria Park was actually located outside of Brisbane City. So we think of it now as an inner city park, but originally it was right on the outskirts of town, and it's over what is called one of the boundary roads of Brisbane. So when Brisbane was settled, they established boundary roads around all the sides of it, which mark the edge of the city. Victoria Park is north of the boundary road, so it's outside the city. And this meant that as Victoria Park as Brisbane expanded, Victoria Park became a place of refuge for Aboriginal people. So people who had been living in where the CBD is now were pushed out, and Victoria Park became a place they could live. At this time, it was referred to as York's Hollow, and it was named that after an Aboriginal elder who was called the Duke of York. And it was set aside as a water reserve. So you can possibly see on this image of this historical map, it's a little hard to read, but it says York's Hollow Reserve for water supply. After they started using it as a water reserve, and in fact, even while they were still using it for a water reserve, they also used it for quarrying clay, which was for making bricks. They also used it for timber getting, so cutting down trees for all sorts of uses. And those uses continued on at the same time, which you would have thought would not coexist very happily, people harvesting clay and also water at the same time. There were lots of complaints about the quality of water coming out of Victoria Park as a result. As more and more people came to Brisbane, it was also an immigrants' camp. So people who turned up in Brisbane from Ireland or England or anywhere else would go there first before they found somewhere to live. As Brisbane continued to expand, people started to be concerned about the lack of green space being maintained around the city, which again seems ironic for us given that the entirety of Brisbane was contained pretty much in the CBD. But they were concerned that some natural areas be preserved for the use of the people of Brisbane. And Victoria Park was one of those places that they thought would be a good idea. The main problem was that, as I said, it was actually outside of Brisbane. So what was the original version of the Brisbane City Council had no control over the area of Victoria Park, so they didn't really feel they could declare it a park. However, people continued to insist that it become a park, and obviously the people who were getting clay from there were not very happy with that, or the timber getters weren't very happy, but nevertheless, the state government, then the colonial government, actually went through and said, no, we're going to make this a park anyway. So we have this rather strange situation from 1864, which is about 5 years after separation, so after Queensland has become a separate colony from New South Wales, where the park, Victoria Park, is owned by the state, but it's actually day-to-day running is by the Brisbane City Council. They named it Victoria Park after the then regent, Queen Victoria. And because there was this situation where the state owned the park but Brisbane ran it, there was a problem with funding. There was no money to run the park. The state had said, yes, we're gazetting this as a park, but didn't actually provide Brisbane City Council with any money for it. So it just sat there for quite a while. It was used to agist cattle, the timber getters came back. And then as the pressures mounted and population pressures mounted more in Brisbane, people sort of started to think maybe there's a way we can start making money out of Victoria Park. And one of the ways they did that was, first of all, to establish a manure depot on what is now the southwestern corner of the park. It's actually not in the park anymore. It's now, I think, a housing development. But the manure depot was where manure was dumped, and that, of course, was from all the stables that were in the city at the time, but it was also human manure. Because most of Brisbane operated on what they called sanitary pans. So there was a nightman who would come around and take away the night soil, which was human manure. And anyway, all of that would be taken to Victoria Park and dumped. And it served the purpose of providing fertiliser for parks and for crop growing in the area, but also it started to earn Brisbane City Council some money. They also developed a rifle range in the lowest part of Victoria Park, in the Yorks Hollow proper, which is pretty much now where the inner-city bypass is. And the rifle range was used by members of the militia who were based up at Victoria Barracks, and we'll get back to that later. So by the 1870s, Brisbane had a real rubbish problem. So this is partly because, just because there were more people coming and they had nowhere to put the rubbish, but also because there was a real concern about public nuisances, health, disease. The Public Health Act of 1873 had just been enacted, and it said that all municipalities had to come up with a sensible way to dispose of all of the rubbish and all of the manure that was in their towns. Like, you couldn't just leave it at the street anymore. Up until this point, Brisbane had been shipping most of its waste, or a fair bit of its waste, out into Moreton Bay and dumping it. And that was quite expensive. It wasn't a terribly useful method to get rid of the rubbish. So someone came up with the idea that, again, Victoria Park might solve a problem for them. Because here was this, what was really then pretty much an undeveloped wasteland. And this is a photo of Victoria Park taken from the hospital, looking over towards the RNA in the 1870s. And you can see there's really not a lot to recommend it. The heavily eroded area there you can see is pretty much where the rifle range used to be. So they thought, we've got this great big space that's right outside of Brisbane proper, you know, let's use that. We can dig lots of rubbish trenches, we can fill that with rubbish, problem solved. And so it did solve a lot of problems. It let them remove the rubbish from the city, took it out of the city altogether. It also enabled them to reclaim swampy land, because Yorks Hollow, being a swamp, was very low lying. It tended to be inundated. So in order to make that land usable, they wanted to raise up the ground level, and they did that by burying rubbish, and then that would increase the ground level. And also raising of revenue, because they could charge people, ultimately, they would charge people to dump rubbish, and the people who dumped the rubbish would charge the people they collected it from, and so it was a great way to raise revenue. So they started dumping rubbish in the 1870s. They would have men there digging trenches. They dug by hand, which would not have been fun because it's very clay-rich soil. So they have all these men digging these massive trenches and filling it up with rubbish. And then in 1882, they put the railway through. So this is the northern line, what's now called the Northern Line. Then it was called the Sandgate Line. And rubbish dumping just continued on. They continued in the eastern section up until about 1890. And at that point, they said that all of the ground was full, basically. They dug up anywhere that wasn't bedrock, and they'd put rubbish in there, and now there was nowhere left to dig. And they estimate that about 1,000 dray loads of rubbish had been dumped into this section of Victoria Park at this point, just the eastern section. Rubbish dumping continued in the western part of the park probably until the early 20th century. It was supposed to stop about 1900, but from archaeological evidence we think it actually continued on a little bit longer than that. So once the rubbish stops being dumped, they start recreating, they start making Victoria Park a park again. So they had a range of improvements that they started from 1890 in the eastern part of the park when the rubbish dumping stopped. The most notable one of those was 150 camphor laurels that were planted along the east of the rail line in 1890. So you can see the remnants of the avenue there. There actually, a few of those trees are still left in Victoria Park today. They also established the playing fields. That was in the early 20th century, which is what you can see in the foreground of that picture. Again, this is looking from around the hospital down across the playing fields, Gilchrist Avenue, and onto the city beyond. So even though the park was sort of established by 1890, 1900, it still ended up being used for all sorts of other things. In the Depression, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, it was used as a campground for itinerant men. So during that time, of course, unemployment was at extraordinary levels, and men would travel around the country looking for work. So this is one of the places they would come to. They would be put up in tents, they'd be fed a basic diet, and they were put to work in the park. They built the golf course, which is there now. They established Gilchrist Avenue. They built a lot of the paths and the entrance gates that are still there today. So that all dates from that Depression era work camp. And then during World War II, Victoria Park became a military camp. Once Australia, once America entered the war, and the war specifically in the Pacific, Brisbane became one of the key headquarters for the American forces, which meant we suddenly needed to find a lot of places to put a lot of American soldiers. One of the places they were put was Victoria Park. And then once the war ended, instead of just knocking everything down, we actually reused the buildings as for housing commission houses for people who had been displaced. Because there were a lot of people who had come to Australia after the war, and a large population boom, and so lots of people didn't have houses. They were put up in Victoria Park. So the park as we know it today wasn't really established until 1951, which is when they carted away all of the buildings, they knocked everything down, took it off site, and they started replanting. And you can see there's a photograph from the late 1950s of a school class planting trees all through Victoria Park. So we knew that Victoria Park had quite a checkered past, but we really didn't know, given that, how much archaeological evidence would be contained there, because we knew how much change the park had gone through. So would things still be present in the subsurface area, or has everything been destroyed? So we had got a bit of an idea back in 2000, which is when the inner city bypass was put through, late 1990s. So the inner city bypass is constructed on the western side of the rail line, so over that lowest part of the park where the rifle range was. And a Brisbane firm called Archaeology did a series of excavations there, and they found a lot of refuse trenches. And you can see in the blue there, that indicates the areas that Archaeology did their excavations. And there's an image down the bottom of them exposing some of the rubbish trenches. So they recovered over 100,000 artefacts from these excavations, and some of those are now part of the Queensland Museum's permanent collection, so they're of state significance. And they pretty much all date from the 1890s through to the early 20th century. So as I was saying, officially rubbish dumping stopped in Victoria Park in 1900, but from the evidence that Archaeo managed to recover, we think it actually continued on possibly into the 1920s. So when we get today to the Cross River Rail project, we weren't really sure what we might find in the eastern part of the park. No one had ever done any archaeology there before. We didn't know if there were rubbish trenches there before. We didn't know if maybe some of the military past would be preserved there. So it was a very exciting and interesting project to be involved in, because we just didn't know what was going to be there. So here in this images show the project area for Cross River Rail. So it's really just in the rail corridor and also parts of the eastern part of the park. And it turns out we did find quite a lot in Victoria Park. So here is a map showing the areas where we uncovered refuse trenches. So there's about 9 areas all up, all along that eastern boundary of the rail corridor or in the park itself. So here are some images of us digging. The first one is actually under the land bridge, which was also constructed in when the inner city bypass was built around 2000. It was a very nice place to dig because it was under shelter. So when it was raining and everyone else had to leave site, we were quite comfortable under there. You can see in those images different forms of the rubbish trenches emerging. So the rubbish trenches were pretty much exactly the same as Archaeo had found on the other side of the railway tracks. They're more or less 15 to 40 centimetres deep. They are filled with rubbish and then filled in. So there's usually about 30 centimetres between the trenches. The trenches themselves are sort of about 1 to 2 metres wide. And no one really knows how long they go because no one's ever been able to excavate the full length of one. So the estimate is between 10 and 30 metres. So these were big trenches. As I say, I am rather shocked that people dug them by hand. So the rubbish trenches, the level that they're at very much depends on the topography at the time the trenches were made and what has happened in the park since. So they could be 20 centimetres below the surface, they could be over a metre below the surface. They generally consist of a lot of very humic soil, so soil that's been created by organic matter decomposing, so it's very black soil. They also have a lot of bone and shell and ash and charcoal. The ash and charcoal from people's fires and probably also from the trains going past. And they have lots of what you would expect from domestic refuse, so lots of bottles and ceramics, plates, crockery, lots of bits and pieces you get around the home, things that people throw out, things that are broken, things that they no longer need. And you can see here in this image, this is a thick deposit, humic deposit, so it's that really, really black soil. We think this is an area where rather than digging a trench, they've actually filled in a gully, which is, again, what we saw a lot of on the other half of the park as well. And even though this is a rubbish dump, and it has rubbish from all over Brisbane, we were able to see the effect of individual depositional events, well, individual dray loads of rubbish, I suppose. So, for example, in this photo in the bottom corner there, that's a whole heap of soft drink bottles. So there are just hundreds of them. So that's probably come from a soft drink factory. These are all the bottles that broke during refilling or broke during transport, and they've just been chucked on a dray and dumped here. We also had areas where we found a lot of bone and shell, but also great big alcohol bottles, like flagons of gin, not the kind of thing you'd have at home, I would hope. So that's probably come from one of Brisbane's oyster bars. So oyster bars were very popular in the second half of the 19th century. So we were able to see where I guess individual businesses or homes had deposited their rubbish. One of the things that was really interesting in this project was the way we were able to confirm the date of the trenches. Now, since we've been able to go back and do a lot of historical research, we pretty much know when the trenches are from. You know, they started in the early 1870s. We're pretty sure they finished in the 1890. But when we first started, we weren't sure when these trenches dated from. And one of the main clues that we had was the Laurel Avenue that was planted in 1890. So we knew that this Laurel Avenue, which existed in the park, and still does, parts of it today, represented the 1890 historical ground surface. We know that is what was there when they finished dumping the rubbish. And so that provides what we in the business call a terminus antiquem, which means whatever happened, it must have happened before this. So because these camphor laurels are on the surface now and they were planted in 1890, we know that anything beneath them must be older than 1890. And so this demonstrated and helped us demonstrate that these rubbish trenches were actually quite a bit older than the ones on the other side of the park. As I said, from the archaeological material that we recovered, or Archaeo recovered, they probably date from 1890 onwards, whereas our trenches date from 1870 to 1890, which means that between the two sides, we've got almost half a century of rubbish deposits. And it's not a competition, but if it were, it means we would win because ours are older. And you can see here this image of the camphor laurel. This is one of the ones that was actually, we had to remove as part of the project. And so it was cut down and then the root bowl was tipped up. And you can actually see in this, the rubbish trench is intermingled with the roots. So along the very top there, there's a bright orange strip, and that is the natural clay surface, the natural clay sediment that you get in Victoria Park. And then beneath that is this thick black strip, and that is the rubbish trench. So that's that humic material intermingled with all sorts of objects. It's hard to make out in this image, but there are actually bottles and plates and shells and bones and everything all intermingled in those root systems, which again was made for a very interesting archaeological exercise. So, what did we find in Victoria Park? Well, one of the first things we found, actually before we started excavating, was actually located by one of the QR employees who was working in the corridor. He found what turns out to have been a cannonball. It's a 3-pound round shot, which is the proper term for cannonball. It is called round shot because it's solid. It doesn't have any explosive ordnance in it, so it's perfectly safe, but it's just a very heavy, very round piece of metal. We are fairly certain it was fired from a minion cannon, which is a corruption of the French mignon, which is cute. So it's fired from a cute cannon because they were the smallest type of artillery that was around at the time. There's an example of a cannon of the type down the bottom there. I doubt it's the actual cannon. These were repurposed naval cannons. At this time, most land artillery was much heavier. It was like 20-pounder or 40-pounder cannons. A 3-pound cannon really is a very small cannon. So we're fairly certain that this cannonball was found in Victoria Park because it was the training ground for the Brisbane No. 1 Battery Garrison Artillery. Now, when New South Wales and Queensland separated, there was no Australian Defence Force at the time, of course, because we weren't Australia, we were just a series of colonies. So every colony had to have its own militia, its own group of people who would defend the land against invasions from the French or the Russians or whoever. And ours was established in 1860 and was based at Victoria Barracks, which is just up on the hill behind Victoria Park. And because Victoria Barracks is quite small, they had no place to practice firing their guns and rifles, and Victoria Park was used for the purpose. So as we spoke about before, there was the rifle range in Victoria Park, and not being a military person, I had thought rifle range meant rifles, but no, it also means cannon in this case. So people were out in Victoria Park firing cannon through the 1860s and 70s. The rifle range was finally closed in 1883 because of complaints from the hospital, because the hospital is just behind that rifle range, and the doctors were complaining that the sound of rifles and cannonball and everything firing all the time was very disturbing for their patients. They didn't mind if the militia marched, but they didn't want them to be firing things. So they closed down the rifle range. And we found the round shot about 400 metres south of the rifle range, which might just be that somebody was a really terrible shot. It might also be from one of the skirmishes that they held in the park. So in addition to having the rifle range and practicing their rifles and their gun shooting there, the militias also held skirmishes. They'd have mock skirmishes where they'd get the militia from other places in Queensland. So there was a group based at Lytton, Fort Lytton, for example. Also people in Brockhampton. Most of the port towns had a militia. So they would all come down to Brisbane and they'd have a mock battle, and they would fire cannon and everything then. So it's possible that our cannonball dates from one of those skirmishes. And I'm told that the QR code that's there, if you scan that, it will lead you to a 3D visualisation of the cannonball so that you can see it in more detail. One of the other sorts of artefact we recovered from Victoria Park, and recovered quite a lot of, are torpedo bottles. And they're called torpedo bottles because of the shape. They look like a torpedo. So these were containers for what was in the 19th century called aerated water, which is what we today call soft drink. And it was designed this way so that it couldn't stand on its bottom. It had to be laid down. And the reason behind this was because the 19th century, we're finally getting into mass production, mass transit, mass trade. And so goods that were manufactured in London might end up in Sydney or Brisbane one day. And one of the key problems they had with transporting aerated water was being able to keep them fizzy. Because if you have a bottle with a cork and the bottle stands upright, the cork dries out, the drink stops being fizzy. So the simplest solution to this was the torpedo bottle. So it was made so that it had to lie down, which meant the cork stayed wet, which meant the drink stayed fizzy. And this was patented in England by a guy named Hamilton, but obviously he wasn't the first person to come up with the idea. So that sort of pointed, that container with a pointed bottom, amphora, we often call them, date back to the Neolithic. So it's new, but not so new. And the other thing that's interesting about torpedo bottles is that even though they are mass-produced, hundreds and thousands of them are produced, they are still made largely by hand. They are made by people pouring molten glass into a mould, and then someone has to come along at the end and put the mouth on the bottle, the finish, so that blobby thing at the top. So it's a strange time in history where we're sort of moving towards the mass production that we have now, where things can hit the shop shelves without ever actually being touched by someone. We're halfway there, but not quite. And one of the really interesting things that we came across during the excavations were a series of very small ceramic heads. They are a very low-fired ceramic. They're quite porous. They've been hand-painted with decoration. It doesn't show up very well in the image, but the hair is black. The faces are painted white. And they have little red mouths. They've got earrings as well. So they're a series of Japanese styled women's heads. And we really weren't sure what they were for quite a while until we came across Japanese nodding dolls. So these are an early type of decorative item that's been in Japan for a very long time. But these kind of Oriental themed goods became very popular throughout the British Empire in the late 19th century. And so we see these kind of decorative goods, they're often referred to as chinoiserie, all through Australia and Canada and England. Everywhere was very keen on the Oriental style decoration, furniture and items. So our little heads would have originally had a metal, the metal is actually partly still embedded in the head, but on the bottom of this would have been a weight. And then the head would sit on a separate body and the head would wave back and forth when it was with vibration or with breeze or anything like that. So it's kind of a version of the sort of Wackle Elvis, but really a lot older and a lot more respectable. These were probably relatively expensive items. One of the other objects that we had, and is part of quite a few similar such objects, is a ceramic doll's head. So this is a late 19th century lowbrow doll's head. It's called that because the hair comes down quite low on the forehead. It's made of bisque with hand-painted decoration. So bisque is porcelain, but that hasn't been glazed. So this is unglazed porcelain with hand-painted decoration. So they've painted on the blush of her cheeks and the eyes and her hair. And most likely made in Germany. A lot of these items in this time Germany was very big in manufacturing all sorts of different ceramic goods. She was part of a shoulder plate doll, which you can see in the image there. The head sat on a little shoulder plate, kind of like an old-fashioned diver's helmet, and then that was joined on to a cloth body that had ceramic hands and feet. And we found a lot of hands and feet as well. We also found other toys like little doll's tea sets and plates, cups, saucers, all of that sort of thing. And because of the style of the doll, the lowbrow, that is a style that was popular in the sort of 1880s, 1890s. But even if for some reason we couldn't see that that's the type of doll that she was, we would know that she was dated from around that period because she's been manufactured by pouring porcelain slurry into a mould rather than pressing a paste in. And that's a change that happens around 1880. So we know from that sort of technological basis that she dates to after 1880, which is what we would expect anyway. And this is another one of my favourite objects that we recovered, and it might not show up terribly well in the photo, but it's actually a little figurine of a man in a nightdress sitting on a chamber pot. It's a porcelain with hand-painted overglazed decoration. You just see some red there as picking out the corners of his nightshirt and a little button. It was most likely made in Germany, again. Lots of ceramic goods coming out of Germany. And the thing that I find particularly interesting about this is that an almost identical figurine was pulled out of a privy, a toilet, in California that dated to 1890. So we've got here the same figurine that's been manufactured in Germany, that's been found on two completely opposite sides of the world, Brisbane and California. And so again, demonstrating that start of world global trade that we just take for granted now. Also demonstrates the international appeal of toilet humour, which apparently crosses all boundaries of space and time. The other thing I like about this is just that it's so whimsical. We associate the Victorian period with very upright, staunch morals. It seems odd to think that people had figurines of people on chamber pots in their houses, but they did. The next certainly one of the prettiest things we pulled out was actually this Whisky Crock, which is a Jeroboam of Royal Blend whisky, manufactured in Glasgow. Now, Jeroboam is a unit of measure it's actually biblical. So this was like basically saying, this is a litre of whiskey. Again, this is it's that sort of combination between an object that was made en masse, but an object that was also handmade. So this object has been created with what they call underglaze transfer print decoration. So that meant when someone would make the body of the crock, and then someone else, when it was not quite set, when the clay was not quite hardened, would come along and wrap a sheet around it that had a design impressed on it with paint, and then they'd pull that sheet off and the paint would stay, or the glaze rather, would actually stay on the ceramic, and then they would put clear glaze over the top of that. So again, lots of these have been manufactured, but every one of them has had a human touch them, make them. These sorts of objects, like today, were pretty much given to publicans and anyone else as a gift, as a demonstration of esteem. They weren't the kind of things you just picked up down at the corner shop. Another one of the interesting objects that we found, and we found a lot of these as well, were bulk ink bottles. So before you could just buy a pen down at the shop, you would have a fountain pen, which you had to put ink in, or a nib pen that you again had to dip into ink to be able to write, which meant people went through a lot of ink. And when you had a time before you had photocopiers and you had computers and you had typewriters and you had all those things, everything was written by hand. And so people went through a lot of ink, especially government departments. So we have a lot of bulk ink bottles, and this probably holds about 500 mils of ink or so. And from this you would fill up your smaller ink wells, which would then be used for writing. So this is a stoneware ink bottle with a salt glaze, which basically just means that when they put it in the kiln, they threw a heap of salt over it. It gives you that kind of orangey, burnt look. Again, though, it's been finished by hand. So the top of the bottle has been shaped into a square shape, and there's someone's made by hand a little spout for pouring. It's stamped on one side with the maker's name, which is Stevens Ink, from London. And then on the other side, it's actually stamped with a British registration diamond. So this was a trademark system. So when you had a design that you wanted to stop people from stealing, you could register it. And this is what the registration diamond shows. In this case, it shows that this particular design for this particular bottle was registered on the 28th of March, 1876. And so the number at the top sort of refers to the class of goods. So in this case, it's a ceramic, and then the numbers to the left and right refer to the date. And so one of the other objects that we found a lot of in the excavations were tobacco pipes. They're a really common item in archaeological deposits for a number of reasons. They were obviously a lot of people smoked, so there were a lot of people using tobacco pipes. Tobacco pipes, they were very cheap. They were reusable, so if you bought one, you would use it several times, but they were also disposable because they were so cheap. They were also extremely fragile, so it was very easy to break the stem or whatever, and then you'd have to get a new one. So you have this class of goods that's cheap, that's fragile, and so a lot of them end up in the archaeological record. And because they were such a common item and such a prolific item, they come in myriad styles. The examples here have just shown there's a basket weave pattern with a little rose down the bottom. On the image on On the other side, it's actually, again, hard to make out, but it's actually a hand holding probably a beer mug. So there are all sorts of different designs. And they weren't just decorative or frivolous. They actually could be used to signify things about the person who bought them. So you often get pipes that are marked with Erin go Bragh, or things that would be bought by Irish nationalists. And so you could signal to people who you were by the type of pipe you were smoking. And there's the potential, one of the really exciting things about clay pipes is there's actually the potential for DNA recovery and analysis. So one of the things that has always been an assumption in archaeology is if you get a lot of pipes, you assume that it's a men's site. You know, it's something associated with how men hang out together. It's a pub or a billiard hall or something like that. If you find pipes at a site, you figure there's been men living there because men smoke pipes. That's our modern assumption. But one of the first DNA analyses actually done on pipes was done in America, and the DNA they got back was from a woman. So that has made us rethink our assumptions about how we view the past. And so when you see a pipe like this that's basket weave with roses, I mean, maybe it's just a nice pipe, it probably slightly English sort of bucolic feel, or maybe it was marketed to women. One of the ways we could potentially find that out would be to do DNA analysis on it. DNA analysis will also let us potentially track ethnicity, and maybe even individuals. With Ancestry and all of those sorts of databases now, it's a lot of DNA information is available that we can potentially link people to individuals. So one day we might be able to say that your great-grandfather or great-grandmother or smoked a pipe in Brisbane and left it in Victoria Park, which is a really good way, I think, of linking people to their history. So what does this all mean? What it means is that in Victoria Park, we've got probably the largest colonial refuse deposit in Queensland and probably in Australia. So it is an extraordinary resource. There were obviously garbage dumps everywhere, but in most places they've been built over, they've been redeveloped. Because Victoria Park was used as a park, more or less, on and off for so long, all of this has been preserved. When we combine it from the assemblage that we know is on the other side of the park, under the golf course, the playing fields, we have a deposit that represents half a century, really, of Brisbane history, of what people were buying, of the decisions they were making, of where they were able to get goods from. We were able to see if there are changes in market access. Can people get goods that are made locally? Are they getting them from Sydney? Are they getting them from New York? So we can see those sorts of trade links. We can also look at paleobotany, looking at plant remains to work out what sort of foods people had. All the things what was available in Brisbane at this time. And we're looking to work with Griffith University and UQ to answer some of those questions about diet, about consumer choice. So altogether, that is just unprecedented research potential. There's all these sorts of questions we can answer that we've never been able to answer before, because we've got such a large assemblage that represents such a large number of people over a large space of time. And most importantly, now that we know that potential is there, we can protect it. So we're currently working with the Department of Environment Science to make sure that the archaeological values of Victoria Park are included in the on the Queensland Heritage Register, so that research potential and the opportunity that it offers to the people of Brisbane is preserved. And that brings us to the end. Thank you very much.